It was a Friday night, and I was driving through Clearfield County, Pennsylvania. I had been visiting a friend in a nearby town, but as usual, I overstayed my welcome and left later than intended. The road ahead of me was a winding, two-lane highway cutting through miles of dense forest. The kind of road where your headlights only reveal the pavement a few feet ahead before everything fades into darkness again. The occasional deer or raccoon darting across the road was the only sign of life. I always hated driving through isolated places like this at night. There's something unnerving about being completely alone in the middle of nowhere. The clock on my dashboard read 11:47 p.m. I still had about 40 miles to go before I'd be home. My gas tank was creeping towards empty, so when I saw a small, rundown gas station up ahead, I breathed a sigh of relief. The neon "open" sign flickered lazily in the window. It was one of those old-fashioned places, the kind that probably hadn't been updated in 30 years. The kind of place that didn't take credit cards and where the attendant was probably the only person around for miles. I pulled up to the pump and got out. The air was crisp, and the stillness of the night was unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, but I brushed it off as paranoia. I began to fill the tank, and that's when I noticed him, an old, battered pickup truck parked at the other end of the station, maybe 50 feet away. I hadn't heard it pull in. The driver, a scruffy man in his late 40s or early 50s, was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette and staring at me. His face was partially hidden by the brim of a worn-out baseball cap. I tried not to make eye contact, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. My hand tightened around the gas nozzle, and I prayed the tank would fill faster. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed too calm for a man hanging out at a gas station in the middle of nowhere this late at night. When the tank was finally full, I replaced the nozzle and hurried inside to pay. The attendant, a bored-looking guy no older than 20, barely glanced at me as I handed him a crumpled $20 bill. I shot a quick glance outside. The man was still there, his eyes fixed on me, his cigarette now just a glowing ember between his fingers. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed back to my car, quickly unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. As I pulled away from the gas station, I couldn't resist one last glance in the rearview mirror. The man in the pickup was still watching me, standing completely still in the eerie glow of the gas station lights. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. There was no reason to think anything of it. He was probably just a local, hanging out at the only place open for miles. But as I continued down the dark, deserted highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I drove for about 10 minutes when the car suddenly jolted to the side. The unmistakable thud of a flat tire sent my stomach dropping. I cursed under my breath and pulled over to the shoulder of the road. The thought of getting out of the car in this desolate place made me shudder, but I had no choice. Grabbing my phone, I switched on the flashlight and stepped out. The tire on the passenger side was completely flat, worse than flat. It looked like it had been slashed. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the deep, jagged cut in the rubber. There was no way this was an accident. Panic set in. I looked around, but there was nothing, just the dark woods on either side of the road. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911, and quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher. She told me to stay put and that a patrol car would be sent out, but it could take some time since I was in such a remote area. As I hung up, the sound of an engine approaching from behind made my blood run cold. I turned to see the headlights of a vehicle coming up the road. My heart sank as I realized it was the same old pickup truck from the gas station. I didn't wait to see if the man would stop. I bolted for the woods, ducking behind a cluster of trees. My breathing was ragged, and I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. From my hiding spot, I watched as the truck slowed down, its headlights sweeping the area where my car was parked. The truck came to a stop just a few feet from my car, and I saw the man step out. He didn't say anything, didn't call out. He just stood there for a moment, looking around as if he knew I was nearby. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. His voice was low, but in the silence of the night, I could hear him clearly. "Yeah, it's done," he said, his voice casual, like this was all routine. "I'll handle the rest. Shouldn't be long now." I held my breath, trying to keep calm as my mind raced. Who was he talking to? What was he planning? My instincts screamed at me to stay hidden, but a part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from this man as possible. I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding relentlessly as I crouched lower in the underbrush. Just as I was deciding whether to make a run for it, I saw another set of headlights approaching from the opposite direction. A second car was coming. I knew this was my chance. The second car's headlights grew brighter as it approached. My heart raced with hope. I had to make my move before the man in the pickup truck had a chance to do anything. Taking a deep breath, I bolted from the woods, stumbling slightly as I burst out of the tree line. The cool night air stung my face, but I didn't care. I waved my arms frantically at the oncoming car, praying the driver would stop. "Help! Please!" I shouted, my voice cracking from a combination of panic and exhaustion. The car, an older sedan, came to a screeching halt. The driver, a middle-aged woman, looked at me with wide eyes, clearly startled by my sudden appearance. I didn't have time to explain, so I just pointed toward the man by my car. "He slashed my tire! He's been following me!" I yelled, my voice trembling with fear. The man by the pickup truck turned around slowly, his expression calm, too calm. He didn't move toward me, didn't say a word. Instead, he just stood there, hands in his pockets, as if none of this was his concern. His lack of reaction made my skin crawl. The woman in the sedan hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between me and the man. Then, thankfully, she unlocked the passenger door and gestured for me to get in. I scrambled inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull the seatbelt across my chest. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, clearly still in shock herself. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought she might say something, but the words never came. Instead, she hit the gas, and we sped off down the road, leaving the man and his pickup truck behind. I kept looking back, half expecting to see the old truck's headlights following us, but they never appeared. The road stretched ahead, winding through the dark forest, with only the occasional flicker of distant lights. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the sound of my own ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally spoke, her voice shaky. "Are you okay? What happened back there?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I don't know," I admitted. "I stopped at a gas station, and that guy, he was there. He was just watching me. Then, not long after I left, my tire blew. It was slashed, I'm sure of it. And then he showed up again." She glanced at me, her eyes full of concern. "That's terrifying. Do you think he was trying to?" "I don't even want to think about it." I shook my head, unsure of how to respond. What had he been planning? Why was he just standing there, as if waiting for something? I didn't have answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread. We drove in silence for a few more minutes before the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in the distance. Relief flooded through me. I wasn't safe yet, but at least now I had help. The woman pulled over, and I got out, waving down the officer as he stepped out of his car. His name tag read, Officer Hayward. And he was tall, with a no-nonsense look about him. His flashlight beam swept over me, then the car, and finally the road behind us. "Are you the one who called 911? He asked, his voice steady. "Yes," I replied, my voice still shaky. "That man in the pickup truck, he's back there. He slashed my tire. I think he was following me." Officer Hayward narrowed his eyes, looking down the road as if expecting to see the truck appear at any moment. He nodded once, then gestured for me to sit down in the back of his patrol car. The woman who had picked me up stayed nearby, her arms crossed, still visibly shaken. "Stay here," the officer said before heading back to his car. He grabbed his radio and spoke into it, likely calling for backup. After a few moments, he walked back to me. "All right," he began. "I'm going to head down the road and check on your car. I'll keep an eye out for the pickup truck. Sit tight." As he drove away, the night felt heavier, more oppressive. I was alone again, even though the woman was still there. We stood by her car, both of us glancing nervously down the dark road. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of another vehicle approaching. My stomach clenched, but it was just the officer returning. When he stepped out, his expression was unreadable. "I found your car," he said. "No sign of the pickup truck though. Looks like he's gone." I exhaled a shaky breath. "What about the tire? Was it slashed?" He nodded. "It was. Pretty deep cut too. Whoever did it knew what they were doing." His eyes darkened slightly. "I'll write up a report, but there's not much to go on. The guy's gone, and without any more information, it's hard to say what his intentions were." That sent a shiver down my spine. What had his intentions been? Why did he just stand there watching? And who was he talking to on the phone? The officer took my information and assured me that he would keep an eye out for the truck in the area. He offered to call a tow truck for my car, and the woman, whose name I still hadn't learned, offered to drive me to a nearby motel where I could wait for the repairs. I thanked her, grateful beyond words that she had stopped when she did. As we drove away from the scene, the questions continued to swirl in my mind. Why had he targeted me? Had it been random, or had he followed me from the gas station for a reason? A few days later, I called the police station to follow up on the report. The officer who answered sounded confused. "There's no record of any report from that night," he said. "Are you sure it was Officer Hayward who helped you?" I froze. Hayward had been wearing a badge, a uniform, everything. But if there was no report, then who had he been? And what had really happened that night on that lonely road in Clearfield County? To this day, I never got an answer. The man in the pickup truck was never found. And sometimes, late at night, I still see those headlights in my mind, still feel that burning gaze from across the gas station parking lot. I escaped, but a part of me wonders if I was ever really meant to. Winter in New England can be brutal, especially during a storm. That night, as I drove along the winding roads blanketed in snow, the wipers of my old Subaru fighting a losing battle against the freezing sleet, I realized I wouldn't make it to Liam's place. We'd planned to spend the weekend together, but as the sky darkened and the storm grew more violent, it was clear I'd need to stop. The snow was coming down so fast I could hardly see more than a few feet ahead, and every mile brought a new patch of ice threatening to spin me off the road. My phone's GPS was useless, constantly recalculating as the signal wavered in and out. That's when I saw it, a small diner just off the highway, its neon sign flickering weakly through the snow. It seemed like an oasis of warmth and light in the middle of a white desert. I pulled in, the wheels of my car crunching over the icy gravel, and parked beside a beat-up truck that looked like it hadn't moved in days. Inside the diner, the warmth hit me first, then the smell, greasy food and stale coffee, with a faint undertone of cigarette smoke. There were only two other people inside, a grizzled older man in a thick plaid jacket hunched over a plate of fries, and a guy maybe a few years older than me sitting at the counter. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair peeking out from under a beanie, and he looked like someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He caught my eye and smiled, a little too eagerly. I ordered a coffee, and before I could even think about asking where I might find a place to stay for the night, the guy at the counter, Toby, he introduced himself, was already offering suggestions. "You won't make it much further in this weather," he said, gesturing outside at the blizzard that was now in full swing. "There's a little motel just a mile down the road. Nothing fancy, but they've got heat and clean rooms. I'm headed that way myself." I hesitated. Something about his friendliness struck me as odd, too forward. But when I glanced back at the window, Where the snow was swirling in angry gusts, the idea of pushing on any further seemed reckless. Plus, I figured, it was just a recommendation. I could make my own decision once I got there. Thanks, I mumbled, sipping my coffee. I'll check it out. Toby didn't leave right away. He sat with me for another few minutes, chatting about the storm, where I was from, where I was headed. I kept my answers short, not offering much. The whole conversation felt a bit off, like he was fishing for information, but maybe I was just being paranoid. When I stood to leave, Toby finally got up too. See you at the motel, he said with another smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't reply. The snow had already piled up over my car's tires by the time I left the diner, and it took a few nerve-wracking attempts to get the engine going. Following Toby's truck was easy enough. The road was empty except for us, and his taillights glowed like faint beacons in the snow. A few minutes later, we pulled into the lot of the motel he'd mentioned. It was one of those places that looked like it had seen better days, the kind where the paint on the sign is peeling and the lobby smells like mold. But it was shelter, and at that point, that was all I cared about. I parked my car and walked inside. The man behind the front desk was thin and tired-looking, his face drawn with lines that made him appear older than he probably was. He glanced at me without much interest as I asked for a room. Single or double? He asked, his voice rough. Single, please. The room he gave me was on the second floor, overlooking the parking lot. The walls were thin, and the heater rattled in the corner like it might give up at any moment, but at least it was warm. I was about to take off my coat when I noticed something strange. Across the parking lot, parked just a few spaces away from where I left my car, was an old sedan, its windows fogged up from the cold. I didn't remember seeing it there when I arrived. Then I heard the noise, a faint rustling sound coming from the bathroom. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened closer, I realized it was more than that. Someone was in there. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Who the hell could be in my room? I hadn't even been here long enough for anyone to follow me. Slowly, I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the bathroom. The rustling stopped, but I wasn't about to stick around to see who, or what, was in there. I bolted. I ran down the stairs, nearly slipping on the icy steps, and rushed to the front desk. The man was still there, looking as disinterested as before, like he'd seen it all 100 times. There's someone in my room! I gasped, out of breath. In the bathroom! The man blinked slowly. For a second, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he sighed, reached for the phone, and dialed a number. But instead of calling the police, he muttered something into the receiver, something too low for me to hear clearly. A few minutes later, I saw Toby's truck pulling out of the lot. I watched as it disappeared into the night, my mind racing. Why had he left so suddenly? And why didn't the motel worker seem concerned? Don't worry, the front desk guy said, finally hanging up the phone. I'll give you another room. You'll be fine. I didn't feel fine. But what choice did I have? The storm outside had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and there was no way I could drive in that. Reluctantly, I took the new room key and headed upstairs again, trying to shake the sense of unease that clung to me like the cold. The second room was much like the first, basic, with the same rattling heater and thin walls. But this time, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Still, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window made me jump. Something wasn't right about this place. Something wasn't right about Toby, or the man at the front desk. I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I woke up with a start, disoriented. The pale morning light filtering through the thin motel curtains barely lifted the oppressive gloom that still hung in the air. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. My pulse quickened, and I glanced toward the bathroom door, half expecting to hear those same unsettling noises again. But all was silent. I pushed myself out of bed, shivering as my feet touched the cold linoleum floor. My phone was dead, and I silently cursed myself for not plugging it in the night before. I needed to get out of here, but the blizzard from last night still raged, the wind howling against the windows. It seemed the storm wasn't going to give up anytime soon. I quickly dressed, my movements rushed and nervous. The memory of Toby's sudden departure, the motel worker's strange call, and that car in the parking lot weighed on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I was about to grab my keys and make a break for it, blizzard be damned, when curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't imagined those sounds coming from the bathroom. And I hadn't imagined that car appearing out of nowhere. But the question nagging at the back of my mind was, why? Who was in my room last night, and why hadn't the motel worker seemed alarmed? I approached the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew it was probably a bad idea, but I had to know. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, everything seemed normal. The small, dingy bathroom looked just as it had when I first entered the room. Grimy tiles, a rusty sink, a cracked mirror. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then I saw it. Behind the shower curtain, peeking out from the corner of the tub, was a piece of cloth, dark, soaked, and crumpled like it had been hastily shoved there. My stomach twisted. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before pulling the curtain back fully. There, lying in the bottom of the tub, was a shirt. It was drenched in something dark and sticky, something that looked an awful lot like blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I let the curtain fall back into place. What the hell was this? Suddenly, I couldn't stay there another second. Grabbing my things, I practically ran out of the room and down the stairs, heading straight for the front desk. But when I got there, the man from last night was gone. In his place was a woman, older, her face kind but worn. She greeted me with a smile that felt out of place given the circumstances. "Leaving already, Han?" she asked, her tone friendly. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the edge of panic creeping in. "Where's the guy who was here last night? The one who gave me my room?" The woman frowned, confusion crossing her face. "Guy? Sweetie, I've been working the desk all night. No one else has been here. You must be mistaken." My blood ran cold. "No, there was a man, older, thin, he gave me my key when I checked in." The woman shook her head, still smiling, but now it looked more like pity. "You must be tired. It was just me, all night." I felt dizzy, like I was caught in some kind of surreal dream. But the noises in the room last night, there was someone in the bathroom, and I stopped myself. There was no point in explaining. She was looking at me like I was crazy. I didn't have time for this. All I wanted to do was get out of this place. I handed her the key without another word and rushed out the door into the biting cold. The snow was piled high, and the wind was still fierce, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from that motel, away from whatever strange game was being played there. As I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock my car door with frozen fingers, I noticed something else that made my stomach drop. The old sedan from last night was gone. It didn't make any sense. No car could have left in the middle of that storm without me hearing it. And yet, it was like the car had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't. Had I imagined it? Had the whole night been some kind of fever dream brought on by exhaustion and fear? I didn't want to find out. I needed to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life, cutting through the eerie silence of the parking lot. As I backed out, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, someone standing in the doorway of the motel, watching me. It wasn't the woman from the front desk. It was Toby. My hands clenched the steering wheel as I sped out of the lot, my heart hammering in my chest. What the hell was going on? Why was he still there? He'd left last night, hadn't he? I could still see his truck pulling out of the lot, his taillights disappearing into the snow. But then I remembered the blood-stained shirt in the bathroom. Had something happened after he left? Or had he never left at all? I drove as fast as I could without sliding off the road, the storm still raging all around me. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, on the main highway, the motel and its secrets fading into the rearview mirror. By the time I reached Liam's place, the storm had died down, and the sky was a dull, gray overcast. I was shaking, more from the adrenaline than the cold, but I couldn't explain any of it to him. How could I? He'd think I was losing it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I hadn't. The following days were a blur. I tried to push the events of that night out of my mind, but the image of that blood-stained shirt kept haunting me, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Toby standing there in the doorway, watching me leave. I finally decided to call the local police to ask if there had been any reports from the motel. They checked, but there was nothing. No suspicious activity. No missing persons. Nothing. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. Something had happened at that motel, something dark. And as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Toby, and the motel worker, whoever he was, had been involved in something far worse than just a late-night scare. The experience changed me. I've never trusted strangers the same way since. Every time I pass a motel on the side of a lonely road, I think about that night. And I wonder, who else has checked in and never checked out? It was mid-November, and I had a job interview that could potentially change my life. I'd been stuck in New York City for too long, working dead-end jobs and barely scraping by. When 2 companies in North Carolina offered me interviews within the same week, I felt like it was a sign. The thing was, I didn't have enough money to fly. Hell, I barely had enough for gas. But this was my shot, so I packed what little I had into my beat-up old car and hit the road for the nearly 10-hour drive. I left the city around 3 p.m., hoping to make it to North Carolina by midnight. The drive wasn't bad at first, the sun was still out, and I had some good music to keep me company. But as the hours passed, the sky turned a deep navy blue, and the highways became desolate stretches of black asphalt illuminated only by my headlights. By 9 p.m., I was starting to feel the exhaustion setting in, and I still had a few hours left to go. I thought about pulling over to take a break, but something inside me kept saying to push on. Then I saw him. It was subtle at first, just a figure on the side of the road as I sped by. A man in a suit, standing perfectly still. My headlights caught him just long enough for me to see his silhouette, a tall, thin man with his hands by his sides, not waving for help or trying to flag me down, just standing there as if waiting for something. I shook my head and blinked hard, chalking it up to the tricks my mind plays when I'm tired. Just a guy who needs a ride, I thought, though it was odd to see anyone in a suit at this hour, miles away from any town. I kept driving, trying to focus on the road ahead. But about 20 minutes later, there he was again. Same man, same suit, standing by the highway. This time, he was a bit closer to the road, almost in the lane. I swear, it was like he was facing my car directly. My heart raced as I passed him. I glanced in my rearview mirror, expecting to see his figure fade into the distance, but the darkness swallowed him whole. I told myself I was just tired. I mean, how could it be the same guy? I was going 70 miles per hour. There's no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Maybe it wasn't even the same man. There are lots of guys in suits, right? But the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I turned up the music, hoping to drown out the eerie feeling creeping up my spine, but my mind kept replaying the image of that man standing so still. There was something off about him, too stiff, too calm, like he didn't belong out there on the side of the highway in the middle of the night. Another hour passed, and I was starting to feel desperate for a break. I spotted a rest area sign up ahead and decided to pull over, hoping a strong cup of coffee would shake off the creeping paranoia. The place was deserted, as I expected for this time of night. Just a few trucks parked in the distance, their drivers probably fast asleep in their cabs. I parked near the vending machines and made my way toward the coffee dispenser, my eyes darting around the dimly lit area. That's when I saw him again. Standing under one of the streetlights was the man in the suit. He wasn't moving, wasn't walking toward me, just standing there, bathed in the dull yellow light like a shadow brought to life. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like he was staring right at me, though I couldn't make out his face from where I stood. I fumbled with the coins in my hand, dropping one on the ground as my fingers trembled. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and leave, but I forced myself to keep going. "It's not real," I muttered under my breath. "You're just tired. It's a coincidence." After grabbing my coffee, I made my way back to the car, my eyes flicking nervously toward the man every few seconds. He hadn't moved. Still just standing there, as if waiting for something. I got into my car and locked the doors, feeling a surge of relief. I took a sip of the coffee, but it did little to calm my nerves. My hands were shaking so badly that I spilled some on my lap. I was too scared to wipe it off. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing under the streetlight as I drove away, the yellow glow fading into the night. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with thoughts. Was I losing it? Was this some sort of hallucination from the stress of the interviews? I didn't know, but I needed to get out of there. I kept driving, but the tension in my chest didn't ease. I decided to pull into a random parking lot a few miles down the road to take a nap. I was beyond exhausted, and I figured some sleep would help clear my head. I parked in the far corner of a dimly lit lot, reclined my seat, and closed my eyes, praying that when I woke up, everything would make sense. That's when the nightmare began. It started with a sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes slightly, just enough to see the outline of my car's interior in the dark. Then I saw it, a figure in the rearview mirror. The man in the suit was sitting in the back seat of my car. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. His face was shadowed, but I knew it was him. The same suit, the same unnerving stillness. He wasn't moving, just sitting there like he belonged. I screamed. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is waking up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the car eerily quiet. I whipped around, expecting to see him there, but the back seat was empty. The parking lot was silent, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. It had to be a dream. A hallucination. There was no other explanation. I rubbed my eyes and checked the time. It was nearly 5 a.m., and I had to get to my interview. There was no time to dwell on what had just happened. But the image of him sitting in my back seat stayed with me. It felt too real. Too vivid. I started the car and got back on the highway, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I rolled into Raleigh, it was 8 a.m. I had just enough time to freshen up at a gas station before heading to the first interview. My hands were still trembling from the night's events, but I forced myself to focus. This interview was too important to mess up over some lack of sleep or, worse, a hallucination. I kept telling myself that the man in the suit was a figment of my tired mind, nothing more. As I approached the downtown office building where the interview was being held, the hustle and bustle of the city helped distract me, at least momentarily. The streets were full of people heading to work, faces I could focus on, all living their regular lives. It helped me feel grounded again. I parked, grabbed my portfolio, and gave myself a once-over in the mirror. I looked like hell, bloodshot eyes, dark circles, the works. But I had no choice. I needed this job. When I walked into the building, the receptionist directed me to the 5th floor. My stomach was in knots. I took the elevator up, mentally rehearsing my answers to every possible question they might throw at me. The doors opened, and I stepped into a sleek, modern office with glass walls and chrome accents. A woman at the front desk smiled at me, then led me to a conference room where I was supposed to meet the hiring manager. As I sat there, I went through my notes one last time, trying to shake off the exhaustion that still clung to me like a wet blanket. The door opened, and I stood up, plastering on my best professional smile. That's when I saw him. The man in the suit. I froze, my blood running cold. It wasn't just someone who looked like him, it was him. The same black suit, the same thin frame. His face was clearer now in the daylight, but it did nothing to ease the terror rising in my chest. He had high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and cold, dark eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His mouth curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm Mr. Armitage. Shall we begin?" I stood there, unable to speak. My mouth had gone dry, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. How could this be happening? The same man I'd seen on the highway, in the rest stop, and in my car was now standing in front of me, introducing himself as the person interviewing me for a job. I managed to stammer out a greeting and shook his hand. His grip was cold, almost too cold, like he'd just come in from a freezing winter night, even though the day outside was warm and sunny. My head was spinning, and I could barely focus on what he was saying as he gestured for me to sit down. The interview started, but I was barely present. I could hear him talking, asking me the usual questions about my experience, my goals, and how I would fit into the company, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was the fact that this man, the man I'd seen on the road, the man I had dreamed of sitting in my back seat, was real. He wasn't a hallucination. He wasn't some product of my sleep-deprived mind. Or was he? As I sat there, nodding along to his questions, I started to doubt myself again. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the man on the highway had just been some random guy, and this was all a coincidence. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. His eyes never left mine, and I felt like he was studying me, reading every nervous twitch, every uneasy breath. The interview dragged on for what felt like an eternity. My answers were robotic, disjointed. I could see the disappointment in his eyes as I stumbled over basic questions. It was clear that I wasn't making a good impression, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I just wanted to get out of that room, away from him. When it was finally over, I stood to leave, practically running out of the conference room without a second glance. I heard him call after me, "We'll be in touch," but his voice seemed to echo in my ears, as though coming from a great distance. I bolted out of the building and into the fresh air, gasping like I'd been holding my breath for hours. My hands were shaking again, and I realized I'd left my portfolio in the conference room. But there was no way I was going back in there. I didn't care about the job anymore. I just needed to get away. I sat in my car for a while, trying to calm down. I had another interview that afternoon with a different company, and I knew I couldn't afford to screw that one up too. After a few deep breaths, I managed to get my mind in order. Whatever had just happened, I told myself it was over. Maybe the stress of the drive and the sleepless night had played tricks on me, but I had a second chance now. I couldn't let this one slip away. The second interview was in a smaller office on the other side of town. As soon as I walked in, I felt a wave of relief. The atmosphere was different, warmer, more inviting. The receptionist greeted me with a genuine smile, and when the hiring manager came out to meet me, he was nothing like the man in the suit. This time, I nailed it. My answers were sharp, my mind clear. The anxiety that had gripped me all morning seemed to fade away, and for the first time in hours, I felt like myself again. The interview ended on a high note, and I left the building with a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe things were turning around. That night, I checked into a cheap motel just off the highway, too exhausted to drive back to New York. I collapsed onto the bed, my body heavy with fatigue, and let sleep take me. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound, like someone moving around in the darkness. I sat up, straining my ears. The noise was faint but unmistakable. I reached over to turn on the lamp, but my hand froze halfway. There, standing in the corner of the room, was the man in the suit. He wasn't moving, just standing there, his dark eyes locked on me. My body went rigid, the fear so intense I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. He stepped forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. Slowly, deliberately, he walked to the side of the bed, standing over me. His face was shadowed in the dim light, but I could feel his eyes boring into me. Then he leaned in close, his cold breath brushing against my ear. "We'll be in touch." I bolted upright, gasping for air, and flicked on the light. The room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could barely think straight. I searched every corner of the room, convinced that he had been there, but there was no sign of him. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I got a call from the second company. They offered me the job. I accepted, but I didn't move to North Carolina. I couldn't. Even after accepting the job, I couldn't bring myself to move to North Carolina. I made excuses to the company, asked to work remotely, and eventually, they agreed, though not without some reluctance. At first, I told myself it was because I needed more time to settle my affairs in New York. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was terrified of what, or who, might be waiting for me if I went back.